Welcome to Missing in Color, a podcast dedicated to telling the stories that don't always get the attention they deserve. The missing, the overlooked, the cases that live in the background while the world moves on. Here, we slow things down. We don't just focus on what happened, we focus on who it happened to. Because every case file starts with a name and a life that existed long before it became a headline. Some of these stories are unresolved. Some still don't have answers that feel like closure. And some are only now being understood the way they should have been from the very beginning. I'm Anaya, and this is Missing in Color. Before we begin, a quick warning. This episode discusses themes that may be difficult for some listeners, including the disappearance of minors and references to violence and loss. Listener discretion is advised. The call didn't start as an abduction investigation. It started with a mother who couldn't reach her children. At first, there was nothing unusual about it. Kids don't always answer the phone. Messages get missed. Phones die. But as the hours passed, that familiar kind of worry started to shift into something heavier. Because no matter how many times she tried, there was still no response. No voices in the background. No quick explanation. Nothing. So she did what any parent eventually does when silence goes on too long. She went to check for herself. And what she found inside that moment would turn confusion into panic. Because her children weren't just ignoring calls. They were gone. When officers were finally called to the scene, it wasn't clear what they were walking into. A welfare check, a missing persons report, maybe something else entirely. But inside the home, there were no immediate answers. No signs that told the full story right away. Just silence and questions that didn't make sense yet. At first, investigators didn't treat it like a clear-cut abduction or missing persons case. There was no obvious suspect, no confirmed timeline, no immediate explanation for what had just happened inside those walls. Just one growing problem. The longer they looked, the less things seemed to add up. When did it happen? Who was the last person to see them? And how does an entire situation like this go unnoticed until a mother has to walk into it herself? The answers would take time, far more time than anyone expected. But before the investigation, before the details, before the case file, there were two girls living a life that on the surface looked completely ordinary. And to understand what happened to them, we have to go back to the beginning. On the morning of July 6, 2001, 10-year-old Tionda Bradley and her 3-year-old sister Diamond were left home in their Chicago apartment while their mother went to work. By noon, both girls had vanished. A handwritten note was left behind. A mysterious voicemail would later surface. And more than 20 years later, no one knows what happened to either child. This is the disappearance of Tionda and Diamond Bradley. Tionda Z. Bradley was born on January 20th, 1991, in Chicago, Illinois. She was the second oldest of 4 sisters: Rita, Tionda, Victoria, and Diamond. Family members described Tionda as intelligent, kind, and fiercely protective of her younger siblings. She especially loved caring for Diamond and was often seen carrying her around on her hip. Tionda was also a talented gymnast who frequently placed first in competitions. Outside of gymnastics, she enjoyed dancing and playing double dutch. Although she was outspoken among family and friends, she was known to be cautious around strangers. Many people described her as mature and responsible for her age. Diamond Yvette Bradley was born on November 25th, 1997, in Chicago, Illinois. At just 3 years old, Diamond was described as energetic, playful, and full of personality. Family members remembered her constantly running around the apartment, jumping from couch to couch, and following her older sisters wherever they went. Like many younger siblings, Diamond looked up to Tionda, and the two were known to be extremely close. Before anything went wrong, they were just living their lives, the kind of lives that don't feel like they'll ever become a part of a true crime story. School days, regular routines, familiar faces, the same kind of days most people don't think twice about. Nothing about it stood out at the time, and that's usually how these stories begin. The night before the girls disappeared, July 5th, 2001, Victoria and Rita Bradley spent the night with their grandmother, Mary Bradley, at the Robert Taylor homes. Meanwhile, Tionda and Diamond remained at their apartment in the Lake Grove Village apartments. Later that night, around 7 p.m., their mother, Tracy, had two friends over to watch the baseball game, and this lasted until around 10 p.m. before the friends went home. At some point between approximately 3 and 4:30 a.m., Tracy Bradley's boyfriend, George Washington, arrived at the apartment. George was also believed to be Diamond's father. Around 6:15 a.m., Tracy left for work at Robert Taylor Park, where she prepared breakfast and lunch for children attending a summer camp program. According to reports, the plan for the day seemed fairly simple. George would drive Tracy to work, pick her up later that afternoon, and then return home so the family could prepare for Victoria's upcoming birthday celebration. Victoria would be turning 10. The following day, the family was reportedly planning a camping trip to Lake Schaefer, Indiana. When Tracy and George left the apartment that morning, Tionda and Diamond remained at home. Now, during this time, it wasn't uncommon for children to stay home alone for short periods of time, as long as they understood basic safety rules, like not opening the door for strangers and not leaving the apartment. And remember, this is 2001. Times were a little different, and family members later stated that Tionda was considered very responsible and understood those rules. While at work, Tracy attempted to check on the girls. Between approximately 7 and 8 a.m., she called the apartment twice. Neither call was answered. Phone records would later show that several additional calls made to the apartment that morning also went unanswered. Now, this could be because the girls were still sleeping. It was very early in the morning, and these are young kids. They might not be up yet. Investigators would eventually discover that an outgoing call was placed from the apartment phone to Tracy's cell phone at approximately 8:17 a.m. Tracy did not answer that call. At the time, there was no indication that the missed call would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. When Tracy returned home around noon, the apartment was unusually quiet. She searched the residence looking for Tionda and Diamond, but neither child was there. Inside the apartment, Tracy found a handwritten note believed to have been written by Tionda. The note indicated that the girls had gone to a nearby playground and store. The playground they were referring to was located at Doolittle Elementary School, where Tionda was taking summer classes at the time. The house and school were relatively close, with only about a 2-block distance between the two. Believing the girls may have gone somewhere nearby, Tracy began contacting family members to see if anyone had seen them. Tracy was the eldest of 9 siblings, and they had dozens of family members living in the area, so it was possible the girls may have been with someone from the family. At first, family members conducted their own search of the neighborhood. What stood out about this search, however, was that George, the father of 3-year-old Diamond, did not participate in the search at all. When those efforts proved unsuccessful, police were eventually contacted at approximately 6 p.m. By that point, the girls may have been missing for as many as 12 hours. Now, most people will be very confused as to why Tracy did not contact the police immediately about the disappearance. And I'm sure this question came up with police as well. However, Tracy explained her reasoning and said that she was afraid of Child Protective Services getting involved because she had initially left the girls home alone. The disappearance of Tionda and Diamond triggered one of the largest search efforts in Chicago history. Investigators searched more than 5,000 abandoned buildings, open fields, railroad cars, and surrounding properties. Chicago police, the FBI, volunteers, K-9 units, and Marine search teams all participated in the effort. Hundreds of tips poured in through dedicated tip lines. Despite the massive search, no trace of either child was found. Initially, the handwritten note was one of the few clues available to investigators. However, questions quickly emerged. Some investigators and family members felt that portions of the note appeared advanced for a 10-year-old who was reportedly attending summer school to improve her writing skills. Handwriting experts were eventually consulted. According to reports, analysts concluded that Tionda likely wrote at least part of the note, but may have received assistance. The findings raised additional questions, but investigators were still unable to determine what happened to the girls after they left the apartment. On July 7, 2001, one day after the girls disappeared, Tracy's sister, Faith Bradley, checked Tracy's voicemail. What she discovered would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in this case. The voicemail had been left at approximately 8:17 a.m. on July 6th, the same time investigators observed the outgoing call from the apartment. The message reportedly stated, "Ma, this is Tionda. Pick up the phone. George is at the door. Can I open the door? He said we're going to Jewel to pick up the cake and then we're coming to pick you up from work." The voicemail immediately raised questions. Investigators faced a challenge because two men connected to the family were named George. One was George Washington, Tracy's boyfriend and Diamond's alleged father. The other was a family acquaintance and babysitter, commonly known as Porgy. Determining which George Tionda was referring to became a major focus of the investigation. Adding to the mystery, the voicemail reportedly disappeared from Tracy's phone on July 8th. Fortunately, investigators had already listened to it before it vanished. Although law enforcement retained knowledge of its contents, the original recording was lost. The voicemail suggested that someone known to the girls had come to the apartment that morning and provided one of the last known indications that Tionda and Diamond were alive. Now, at this point, the case starts to get a little confusing. Tionda and Diamond were only 10 and 3 years old. According to both the note and the voicemail, the places they were supposedly planning to go were only a couple of blocks away from their apartment. This meant that they could not have gone very far, especially if they were on foot. Yet, despite one of the largest searches in Chicago history, no trace of the girls were ever found. And that's not the only thing investigators would later examine. Earlier, we mentioned that Victoria and Rita were staying with their grandmother, while Tionda and Diamond remained at home. It has never been entirely clear why the girls were separated that night. This is especially notable because Tionda was expected to attend summer school classes that morning, and authorities later confirmed that she never arrived. And even if she had attended class, there is still the question of who would have been responsible for watching 3-year-old Diamond. Looking back, many people have questioned why all 4 girls were not staying together that night. While there may have been many reasons for the arrangement, it remains one of several questions that continues to come up when discussing the case. Another detail that has drawn attention is the camping trip that was reportedly planned for that weekend. According to reports, the trip to Lake Schaefer, Indiana was supposed to include Tracy, George, Tionda, and Diamond. Victoria and Rita were never expected to attend. Now, personally, this is one of the details I find interesting because Victoria was the one celebrating her birthday that weekend. Naturally, some people have wondered why she wasn't expected to go on the trip. Again, that doesn't mean anything suspicious was happening. It's simply one of the many details that people have questioned over the years. George Washington, Tracy's boyfriend and Diamond's alleged father, was reportedly the person who organized the trip. At the time, George and Tracy's relationship was experiencing some strain. Although George was believed to be Diamond's father, questions regarding paternity had reportedly existed for years. Just weeks before the girls disappeared, paternity testing reportedly confirmed that George was Diamond's biological father. Because of his connection to the family and because he had been there at the apartment that morning, investigators naturally took a close look at George and his movements. It's also very interesting that George planned this trip because, according to the girls, once they got older, George did not really have a relationship with any of the girls. He was just simply Tracy's boyfriend. Now, it's not looking good for George. However, he is not the only one making questionable decisions. Tracy also raises questions. She called the girls twice and did not answer when Tionda called back. between 8:17 a.m. and when she returned home around 11:30, she did not call back again. Now, if she's calling them and expecting an answer, you would think she was keeping her phone nearby so that if they did happen to call back, she could pick it up immediately. And according to a Chicago Sun-Times article, Tracy also borrowed $20 from a neighbor to buy food from Jewel Osco prior to searching for the girls. And Jewel Osco is the grocery store that Tionda mentioned going to in the voicemail and the note. Why Tracy went grocery shopping before searching for the girls is a mystery. Her shopping trip is confirmed by a receipt timestamped at 12:21 p.m. on July 6, 2001. When she did return home, she searched for the girls for 6 hours before contacting police. Many people have wondered why that call wasn't returned, especially since it would later be linked to the voicemail discovered the following day. Similarly, some have questioned why Tracy waited several hours before contacting police after discovering the girls were missing. Tracy later explained that she was afraid Child Protective Services would become involved because she had left the girls home alone that morning. And whether people agree with that explanation or not, it was the explanation she provided. Ultimately, investigators examined everyone closest to the girls, including family members, friends, neighbors, and associates. More than 20 years later, many of those same questions remain unanswered. And unfortunately, the case still remains unsolved. And it's not as if the investigation simply stopped. More than 20 years after Tionda and Diamond disappeared, people are still searching for answers. In 2023, Investigation Discovery released a documentary titled Disappeared, the Bradley Sisters. The documentary features interviews with family members, including Victoria and Rita Bradley, as well as other individuals connected to the case. And I personally watched this documentary, and I found it incredibly informative because it provided additional context that isn't always included in news articles and offered perspectives from people who weren't directly connected to the investigation. I will say that the documentary raised some additional questions for me and made me look at certain aspects of the case differently. However, it is important to remember that questions and suspicions are not the same thing as evidence. At the end of the day, no one has ever been arrested or charged in connection with the disappearance of Tionda and Diamond Bradley. If you watched the documentary, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Did it change your perspective on the case? Did it answer any questions for you, or did it leave you with even more? Before we move on, I want to review the timeline again. On July 5th, 2001, Victoria and Rita Bradley were dropped off at the Robert Taylor Homes complex to stay with their grandmother, Mary Bradley. Then at 7 p.m. that same night, Tracy invited two friends over to watch the Chicago Cubs play against the New York Mets in a baseball game. Diamond and Tionda were home at the time. It is not confirmed who the two friends were, but they stayed for the entirety of the baseball game, which lasted around 3 hours and 10 minutes. So at around 10 p.m., the friends left. After that, between 10 p.m. and George Washington's arrival, another neighbor came to the apartment according to reports, but he never entered further than the front area and did not see the girls. It is not confirmed whether the girls were present at the time. Then on July 6, 2001, between 3 and 4:30 a.m., we know that George Washington arrived at the apartment. At 6:15 a.m., after spending the night, George and Tracy left the home so she could go to work. And at 7 and 8 a.m., Tracy called the home a couple of times to check on the girls. Then at 8:17, an outgoing call was made from the home phone to Tracy's cell phone and was not answered. That voicemail was later discovered on July 7, 2001. Between 11 and 11:30 a.m., Tracy and George returned to the apartment and discovered the girls missing and found the note. At 12:21 p.m., Tracy was at Jewel Osco making a purchase after borrowing $20 from a neighbor. From 12:30 p.m. to 6 p.m., Tracy, her family, friends, and community searched for the girls. And finally, at 6 p.m., police were finally called. And that is the completed timeline. Now, because the case is unsolved, people are going to have their own theories and speculations. And so I compiled a list of them for us. So theory 1 is that someone the girls knew came to the apartment. And this is probably the most widely discussed theory. Supporters of this theory point to the voicemail allegedly left by Tionda, where she states that George is at the door. Because Tionda was described as cautious around strangers, some people believe she would only open the door for someone she knew and trusted. This theory doesn't necessarily identify a specific person, but it suggests that the girls may have willingly left with someone familiar to them. And I personally think that this might be the most accurate theory and the one closest to the truth. The next theory is that the voicemail was the last known clue. Some people believe that the voicemail may represent the last confirmed interaction the girls had before disappearing. The timing of the call, 8:17 a.m., matches the outgoing call from the apartment. If the voicemail is accurate, it suggests that the girls were alive at the time and that someone named George was present or expected to be present. Because the original voicemail was lost, investigators have been unable to conduct additional analysis on the recording itself. And this theory, in my opinion, fits together with theory 1. And after watching the documentary, this theory is kind of interesting because, again, the voicemail doesn't pinpoint one George. Remember, there's George Washington, which is the boyfriend, and the other George, which is the neighbor who also goes by Porgy. While watching the documentary, Victoria and Rita, the remaining sisters, they kind of suggested that Tionda would have never referred to George the neighbor as George, suggesting that they think George W. is suspicious. They insisted that Porgy is what Tionda would have used if the babysitter was at the door. However, critics point out that extensive searches of the surrounding area failed to uncover any evidence and that neither girl has been definitively seen since. Now, theory 4 is that the note was not written entirely by Tionda. Questions surrounding the note have fueled discussions for years. Handwriting experts reportedly concluded that Tionda likely wrote at least part of the note, but questions remain about whether she received assistance. Because of this, some people believe that the note may have been intended to explain the girl's absence or direct attention away from what actually happened. There is no public evidence proving who may have assisted in writing this note, if anyone did. But again, I want to point out that Tionda was in summer school at the time, specifically for her grammar and spelling. And family members pointed out when the note was discovered that it seemed far advanced for her, especially because she was struggling in those subjects. Now, theory 5 is that someone close to the family knows more than what they have said. And this isn't a specific suspect theory, but rather a belief held by some investigators and observers. Cases involving young children often focus heavily on people within the victim's immediate circle, because those individuals typically have the greatest access and knowledge of the family's routines. Supporters of this theory believe someone may still know important information about what happened that morning. That being said, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the case. What theory do you find most compelling, and what questions do you still think needs answers? Now, all 5 of these theories are not that far-fetched. Based on what we know, any of these things could happen. But more than 2 decades later, many of our questions still remain unanswered. And while there are countless theories about what may have happened to Tionda and Diamond, the truth is that much of this case remains a mystery. So before we move on, I want to make something clear. There was never an arrest made in connection with this case. And despite everything we do know, much of the discussion surrounding what happened to Tionda and Diamond is based on circumstantial evidence. Yes, there are decisions that were made that many people have questioned over the years. There are details that some find suspicious. However, suspicion does not equal guilt. Because of that, I want to be careful not to present theories as facts or contribute to speculation that isn't supported by evidence. The people connected to this case are still living. They have families, loved ones, and lives that have also been affected by these events. At the end of the day, no one has ever been charged in connection with the disappearance of Tionda and Diamond Bradley, and everyone is presumed innocent unless proven guilty. That being said, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the case. What theory do you find most compelling, and what questions do you still think need answers? Today, the case remains open. No arrests have been made. Despite years of investigation, searches, media coverage, and thousands of tips, no one knows what happened to the sisters after July 6, 2001. And that leaves one question. What happened to Tionda and Diamond Bradley? Today, both Tionda and Diamond remain missing. At the time of her disappearance, Diamond Bradley was 3 years old. She stood approximately 3 feet tall and weighed around 40 pounds. She had brown eyes, black hair, and a medium complexion. Her hair was worn in braided ponytails with purple ponytail holders. Diamond also had a scar on the left side of her scalp and deep-set eyes. Tionda Bradley was 10 years old when she disappeared. She stood approximately 4 feet 2 inches tall and weighed around 70 pounds. She had brown eyes and brown hair. Tionda had a burn scar on her left forearm about the size of a quarter and a scrape on her left calf. She was last seen wearing green ponytail holders. There have been several age-progressed images released over the years showing what Tionda and Diamond may look like today. I'll actually be posting the most recent age progression on the Missing in Color Instagram, so if you'd like to take a look at it, be sure to check it out there. Personally, I believe that in many cases, someone knows more than they've shared, whether it's a small detail, a memory that once seemed unimportant, or information someone has been afraid to come forward with. Those pieces can sometimes make all the difference. More than 20 years have passed since Tionda and Diamond disappeared, and unfortunately, the girls have been missing for so long that some family members, including their aunt, Sheila Bradley Smith, have publicly expressed doubts that they're still alive. Even so, their family continues to keep the case alive. They continue to ask questions, seek answers, and advocate for Tionda and Diamond, and hope that one day the truth will finally come to light. At the time of the most recent age progression was released in 2025, Diamond would have been 27 years old. In 2025, Tionda would have been 34 years old. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Tionda or Diamond Bradley, please contact the Chicago Police Department or the FBI. Their family has spent more than 2 decades searching for answers. And that was the disappearance of Tionda and Diamond Bradley. Thank you for listening to Missing in Color. If you'd like to see the age progression images discussed in this episode or stay updated on active missing persons cases, you can follow Missing in Color on Instagram and TikTok at Missing in Color. Every case leaves behind more than questions. It leaves behind a life that mattered before the world ever knew its name. And even when the story feels like it's over, the silence it leaves behind isn't. Because every case deserves to be seen, not just as a headline, but as a person. If there's one thing to take from today's case, is that missing is never just a headline. It's someone's life, paused in the middle of everything they were still becoming. I'm Anaya, and this is Missing in Color. Until next time.